it's our goal to vote on the disadvantaged communities criteria next month. So to move us forward in this goal, we've extended our meeting times to 2 hours and have scheduled all the remaining meetings in advance for basically the next 3 meetings in advance. Not all of them, because there will be more coming through the year. Spoiler alert. Next slide, please. So just to quickly go through the meeting process, and just so everyone knows, for folks who might be in one of our public rooms, this is a meeting of the Climate Justice Working Group. This is not a public hearing or a public forum, so we won't be taking testimony or questions from the public during this meeting. But if you have any questions or comments on the proceedings, you can send them to our email address at climatejusticewg@dec.ny.gov. For working group members, the rooms will be muted to reduce noise. Please raise your hand and we'll unmute your room. And because this is broadcast via WebEx, state your name before speaking for transcription purposes. And if you are on video, participating by video chat, we need to have your name on the screen and you need to remain on screen during the meeting to the extent possible. Okay, next slide, please. So with that, we'll do roll call. We'll start here in Albany. It's myself, Alana Cadell-Tucky.
Good afternoon, Chris Cole from NYSERDA.
Hi, this is Neil Muscatello from DOH.
New York City. Unmute New York City. There we go.
New York City's unmuted.
Are we saying hello?
Yes, we're saying hello.
Hello and Happy New Year. It's Eddie and
Hello, here from Riyadh.
Hey guys, and Elizabeth Firth from TMO just joined us. Hi, Elizabeth.
Good to see you all.
And Abby in Region 8. Hello. And we have Jill Hank coming to us from Florida, right, Jill?
Yep. Ready?
And I know that Rawa couldn't be with us today. She is out. Let's see. Do we have any other working group members that are on? The folks in the room. The folks on. Oh, well, we do have quorum, so that's good. Also, we have Alex Dunn joining us. Hi, Alex.
Everyone.
Shannon is also on. I don't know if you'll be talking with us today.
I will be speaking just a little. Hi, everyone.
And as always, we have Saren who will be taking notes. And if there are any technical issues or questions, we have Emma will definitely be helping us out on the back end and running our webinar. Hi, Emma. Okay, well, since we have a quorum present, just, we'll actually vote on the minutes from the December 14th meeting. You should have received the minutes on Thursday, and I sent another copy of the minutes. So actually, could we skip? Sorry, I think I jumped ahead too far in my skipping around the agenda. Next slide, please. Sorry, let's go through the agenda first. We're going to vote on the minutes from December 14th. Then we'll do a quick recap of where we've been, sort of how we got to this point. Have a discussion about the methodological considerations and public comments. Do a quick timeline review, just a temperature check to make sure that we're all still feeling good about where we are and where we're going to be and where we're going to quote unquote end. I will discuss some quick items of interest with regards to the community air monitoring efforts, and then we can quickly discuss our next steps moving forward for February. Does anybody have any questions or comments on the agenda or anything they want to quickly add sort of at the end? All right. No, so next slide, please. All right, so we'll do the approval of minutes. So these are the minutes from our last meeting in 2022 on December 14th. The minutes were sent out for your review. Are there any additions or edits that anyone feels need to be made to the minutes before we move to approve? Okay, so can I get a motion to approve the minutes?
Motion to approve.
Can I get a second?
A second.
All right. Please indicate your approval of the minutes with a yay or nay. We'll start in New York City. Eddie?
Yay.
Okay. Sonal?
Yay.
Here in Albany, yay for me. Chris?
Yay.
Elizabeth? Yay. Neil?
Yay.
Abby?
Yay.
Jill?
Yay.
Elizabeth, did you say yay as well?
I said yes.
Yes, okay. All right, the minutes are, I didn't forget anybody, right? Got everyone? Yep, the minutes are approved. They'll be posted on the Climate Justice Working Group site as soon as we possibly can. All right, what? Oh, just muting, okay. One of the hazards of this particular style of meeting. So next slide, please. We're going to jump right into our presentation and this recap sort of where we've been, and I will throw it to Alex.
Hello, everyone. Happy New Year. So we are going to jump right back in, and because we're jumping right back in and it's been a long time, I did kind of want to recap all the process that we've been through so far. So next slide, please. These are the world's fastest summary slides. That this summarized basically like a year's worth of work on this slide. So previous to the draft criteria voting, I wanted to outline kind of what we did. I think you all remember, but we all worked together to identify 170 different potential indicators. Then we, both the agencies and Illume, went and gathered indicator data for 100 of those indicators. And then we tested the viability and we looked at correlations and how things interweave together. And through lots of discussions and deliberations, we talked through kind of narrowing that down to 45 indicators, which are the ones that are included in the draft criteria. We then combine those indicators into factors, which are kind of like the initial concepts like health or income. Then we combine those different factors into component scores. Those are the two big scores. You've got burdens that are the more environmental climate change risks and vulnerabilities, which are the socioeconomic demographics. Then what we did was multiply those scores together. This is an important highlight here because we're going to discuss a methodological change. Not that we have to change it, but just I want to make sure that we're highlighting the reason we multiplied the different component scores here is because the theory behind this idea that both the burdens and the vulnerabilities exacerbate one another. So multiplying those two scores together shows that interaction, and that kind of multiplies the effects rather than adding. Through a lot of discussion, we ended up deciding to take the top 35% of those highest scores. And then on top of that, we voted to include individual criteria. So world's fastest recap, but now I want to take a little bit more time. And I'm just going to actually jump through, unless people have questions on any of this or want to review any of this. I have some slides that we can hop back to later. But for now, can you?
Alex, this is Sonal from New York. I do actually have a question. I'm wondering if you could remind us
why we took the top 35%?
Yeah, so there was a lot of discussion around the percentage that we were going to use here. And so then what we ended up doing was looking at a lot of maps and trying to find the kind of balance between capturing all of the disadvantaged communities that we think are really disadvantaged, and also making sure that we're not over, basically you have up to 40% or at least 30% of funding, if I'm correct on this, or 35%. Brain's a little rusty right now. But the idea being that the funding is going to be around 35%, and you didn't want to designate too many more disadvantaged community because you didn't want to, how can I put this? Like lose some of that funding, right? And then it would be less than the representation of that proportion. As it stands with the individual criteria on top of that 35% is a lot more than say 30 to 40% of the state. So it's just definitely something worth noting to look at because it was a very, we had a lot of discussions around it, and I'm happy to pull those slides back up and we can have more discussion about it. I can tinker with that so you can see the results.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I do want to put that on the agenda to talk about because I do think we should probably go back and look at that again, considering there were a lot of public comments around that proportion being off. So just something to note that we should certainly address here.
Yeah, and I actually have a note for that in the methodological discussions for today of discussing the 35% because there's some comments that are saying, why are you doing 35, not 25, something like that, to really focus in on different elements. So we'll definitely put that on the list. Any other thoughts on the deliberations we had before as we voted before comments? Okay, you can go to the next slide and you're gonna, I think, yeah, keep going because these are just more details if people wanted it, but keep going. Keep going. More. Okay, go back. So then, we had a break and we got 3,124 comments. And this is what we've done so far with with those comments and then what we've tinkered with so far in the process. We've reviewed those comments. We categorized those comments, summarized the recommendation, like the recommended indicators for inclusion, and we came to you and went through all of those different comments and the categorization of them, but then we also went for the ones that were highlighted as recommended indicators for inclusion. Those were 66 different indicators. And we then kind of reviewed those indicators and prioritized which ones we should look at based on some information about just theoretical correlations between some of the recommended indicators and some of the ones that are already there. And I will show you this list again. But so we ended up with 15 recommended indicators that or prioritized indicators that we went and are following through and trying to run down and get information on. In addition to that, we also summarized the recommended methodological changes. So no, that's where the 35% change that versus not. This is different ones of saying, look at how you are, doing the GIS coding for pollution and landfills. So those are there and we've categorized those. And we've reviewed them with you, but we didn't prioritize those yet. We kind of did some highlighting of things that we thought were interesting in our discussion with you last time. But I have a lot more information there. And we also there were a couple questions about, well, what does the comment actually say? So we dug up all the comments from a lot of these relevant methodological recommendations. And I've got those if you have questions and you want to see the actual language we can find it now. And then finally, we work to identify data sources to assess kind of based on those comments. Any questions on what we've done so far here? Okay, next slide. So this is just a recap with the different types of comments that we got. It's, we had 3,124, but a lot of those were basically the same comment given to us multiple times. And we then took that weight, the idea of like, okay, a lot of people really care about this. But we also took the value of even those that just had one person writing a letter, also with really good ideas, we took those in there as well. So this is where you can kind of see the ideas of additional indicators, and when you start pulling them down, we end up getting to the 66. So next slide. So this was kind of a couple meetings ago, we went through this Excel sheet and we identified the different recommended ones out of those 66, and we prioritized the 15. So I can go back to the 66, but I don't think we need to. I think what we need to do is really focus on the 15 that we prioritized before, and I want to give you an update on those. So you go to the next slide. Oh, yeah, Elizabeth?
Question. Yeah. So I'm just wondering how, in looking at the recommendations that were coming from people, whether it was weighted so that you had, like, if you have universities commenting on the disparate impacts on a local community, like how is that assessed? Or if you've got folks that are not from a community weighing in on what the priorities should be on communities that are impacted, how is that assessed? Was this like a free for all? And I'm sorry if I don't know, where everyone had a say on what happens and what should be prioritized in our communities? Because that, for me, diminishes the validity of the recommendations. So I just wanted some more information about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a really good call out. So we did get some, different entities who are clearly companies that work in the space and have different, very specific things. And where we had the information, and this is, Elizabeth, I think really important, is sometimes we don't have a lot of information from the person or the place where they provided the comment. And so it made it very hard to identify different people. What that meant were two things. When we assessed these, we looked for bias. And, there were a couple clear recommendations that we could tell are not, and I should say, so there was a kind of a conglomerate for diesel fuel, comments. And those didn't actually have any recommendations that were relevant to this. Whereas, there was this one letter I was rereading last night that was one person in the community and had done their research and really looked at things, and so they get equal weight. So what we try to do, because this is hard with incomplete data to be scientific about it, that we try to go on the merit of the recommendation as much as possible and follow through with those things, but also be guided by EJ principles. If that makes sense. But one thing I do think is really important was that we are trying to be the voice of the commenters and trying to, make sure that those are there. So I will say again, I've said this in the past, that one letter that was really well researched and thought out, it's the reasoning behind the recommendations and the thoughts that made that kind of pop out versus someone just saying you should include diesel traffic, redo that in a certain way. So we reviewed everything. We did the best we could on this, and all of the comments and all of these documents are available to you, the working group, to see and to weed through the different ones. A bit of a slog. Some of these comments, these letters are multiple pages. And in fact, I think I extracted 7 different commenting letters, and it's like 35 pages or something. The ones that I thought were relevant for us if we needed to get into more detail. So a lot of content there. Okay, next slide. So one of the things that we wanted to kind of break down was here we had flagged certain ones to review with the working group and review the feasibility for. I'm just going to keep going because what this is kind of a drill down of those different indicators and how we got to the 15 that we are now kind of really trying to run down and look. Next slide. Okay, so the next step that we took was to take the 15 indicators that we were looking through, or actually 27 at this point, and we ran them through the rubric of, is this even possible? So I don't know if you guys remember, but like a year and a half ago, we had this data rubric where we looked at the different metrics and we looked at the potential data sources and we assessed, you know, is this a viable piece of data that we can use? And it was the same process that we did to take down those 170 original indicators that we all brainstormed down to the 100 that we would download. So we did the same thing here. And again, we brought that information to you and we got to the 15 indicators. So next slide. And then separate from the indicator comments, we also got methodological changes. So this is things where it's not just, hey, think about this indicator, you should add this, but it's also things about like, say, you should weight race more, or you should weight limited English proficiency as much or double. You should think about adding population density and then weight that again. So there's like multiple things going on here, but the methodological components here are important. There were also a lot of comments about the use of census tract, which we had discussed, and really there's not much we can do there. We can discuss it and have like a conversation about what we could do as an alternative, but there were a lot of comments about changing census tracts to allow it to be a census block or a block group in rural areas versus a census tract. And while theoretically that makes a lot of sense, computationally it won't work. So we can't have two different levels of measurement, in this case, a census tract versus a census block in our definition. Next slide.
Hey, Alex, before you move on.
Yep. Yep.
Could you go back a quick second, Samir? The delete indicator, do you have was there any kind of common indicator that multiple people suggested we drop? I was just wondering if you had if you could share any insights that may have jumped out at you about particular indicators that folks were suggesting we delete.
Yeah, I've got some written down. I would say that quite a few people wanted to delete or did not think race should be included. There were also a lot of comments that said race should absolutely be included, and this was a comment in support of that. And then some people thought, you know, various little ones like, oh, you shouldn't be using that calculation for the landfill, how you're doing landfill. So it's not deleted, but it's change or review the methodological kind of approach to measuring it. Just you wait though, Eddie, I've got a whole list. Okay, next slide.
Okay, Alex, you need me to pass you the ball?
Yeah, if you can pass me the ball.
Oh, wait, can I pass?
Oh, there we go. Okay.
Okay, got it.
So, share my screen, and I am going to show you the indicators that we were looking into. Okay, now I'm going to try to make this bigger because it seems kind of ridiculous for you to try to like look at tiny things. Is this visible? Okay.
Yep.
So I just want to run down really quickly these indicators. And so in the agenda, we're going to talk about the indicators. I want to give you an update. And then what I really want to spend the bulk of the time on is the methodological components. So we've been looking at these. I want to give you a good update about them and where we're at. Okay. First one is diabetes. And currently DOH is running some preliminary analysis on the data. And so we hope to get data for that in a couple weeks, which is very exciting for us. This is the one that is at the highest chance of us getting data in the next few weeks is this one. This is literally the one. So diabetes is going to be something that we can look at and hopefully before our final vote. But I can't make promises as to whether it's going to be finally included or not, but we will have the data and I will be able to show you some information about it and how we can include it. Houseless, unsheltered people. So the use case was this was because houseless and unsheltered people are at very high risk of climate events and extremely economically vulnerable. One of the issues that we ran into is that we don't have any data for it. It's not available at the tract level. If municipalities are tracking this, there's not a way for us to gather the data. If you all have sources or ideas of what we can do, we've been trying to track it down, but we have no good information for it. I have this column here, and that's next steps. And in here, you'll see things like I'm going to recommend we drop things versus not. These are just my recommendations. I'm open to any and all changes to it, but I wanted to give you kind of a starting point of thought. And one of the recommendations you'll see several times here is monitor daily data availability. In this case, there are some really good recommended indicators in this list, and I think that this is not a one and done, you all vote on the criteria and we're done. One of the most important facets of this is that we are updating and monitoring all the data sources, including those that we already have. And so I want us to also be thinking about flagging things for after this initial vote, but in subsequent time periods for us to be thinking about the data and looking at it. This is one of those that I would recommend doing that for. Next one is state high tax aid. Now we looked into this a little bit more and our team found that this is a specific type of aid that schools receive. And it's a really good flag for burdened communities with low wealth. And we are looking to see if we can get a list of school districts receiving high tax aid. So far, we haven't found it, but if we do, this is something that we can look into incorporating in the future. So when this data is available, we recommend looking into it because I think for me, one of the reasons why I think this is an interesting one is to look at a more community-wide level measurement of poverty. And it goes beyond income in some way. So I think it will be a good one to look into. Please stop me as I can't see everyone if you have questions. And then Alana, if you see a comment, I can't see any of those right now. So just jump in and tell me if there are any.
Will do.
Proximity to airports. This one is something we actually looked into a lot. There were a lot of comments of interest in and recommendations to include proximity to airports as an indicator because it doesn't just overlap with industrial land use that we already have, but it also looks at and kind of incorporates noise pollution and diesel pollution and just so many different things. One thing I would note, because we don't have the data in a way that we could just kind of mark, and it would take quite a lot of doing to do it, is we decided to look at this backward because I have a feeling, well, actually, I can corroborate this. We have a lot of indicators in our data set now, in our list, that already signal this. So we've got low birth weight, industrial land use, we have PM 2.5, We have so many things that in the end, I went and looked at maps of the, with the draft criteria and looked at the airports in New York City, Rochester, and Buffalo. And with the exception of one census tract, all the surrounding touching areas of an airport are DACs. So we cover this without this data point. But I am more than happy to discuss this. I would recommend dropping this for now, but it is something that we can also monitor the data availability and try to geocode this if it's something that this group thinks is important. Okay, zoning practices. Now, zoning practices vary, and the statewide level data is not the best. And this was what the comment was really getting at, was just saying, we should look into zoning practices and the information that you get from, zoning across the state. And one of the issues here is in the comment, they were raising concerns about the use of state level data not capturing zoning in an adequate way. And what we're trying to do here, and I think this is one of those where we just have to flag this for methodological review and start monitoring data availability and what we can do with zoning data, because there's a lot of potential boons to be able to try to get better data here, but it is incredibly variable across different municipalities. And so right now there's no statewide zoning data available. So we've tried to, do an industrial land use to cover some of this at the statewide level, but it's an imperfect method. So this is one that's important, but nothing we can do yet. We've talked to a couple experts on this and tried to figure out what there is we can do. And I wish I could tell you something positive on it. It's too variable. Any questions or thoughts?
A quick question about this. Am I reading it right? Did you say that the state does collect or have data available for industrially zoned land throughout the state, but not the other zoning classifications? Or am I being overly optimistic at what I'm reading or hearing here?
Well, we do have industrial land use, so we have those data statewide, but we do not have other zoning. So within the city, we don't have, a commercial zoning versus residential zoning data.
Thanks.
And then not just that, the issue is not just having it, but also that the different municipalities zone things slightly differently sometimes. And that variability, I think, is what worries me. So that's why I want to flag this for both monitoring the data availability, but then also the methodological review of how people are zoning and what the data are across different regions. What I don't want is for us to ever include a data indicator that has an apples to oranges kind of comparison in different regions, because that's just going to really mess with our criteria. Okay. Access to potable water. This is, I think, clearly the idea here was to show, in particular with other communities where there's been lead in the pipes, there's not potable water, that there could be issues and a lot of severe health implications for this. One thing we looked at is that there's just no statewide publicly available data at the census tract at all for this. It's not consistent. We do have, well, no, there's nothing that we can do, and we can monitor the data availability for this, but I'm not sure that it's going to add a huge amount more than what we're already trying to get at with different health aspects and pollution and industrial land use and various things like that. So something to put into kind of the let's discuss. I would recommend dropping it just because I think that this one is just not even tracked at all. And while it should be, the chances of us getting data on it are very slim. Okay, I'll move on. Illegal dumping. We looked at this for high health implications, and we kind of discussed this last time, and there were some notes about looking at what New York agencies are tracking, and any information of here that we might have here. Our hypothesis, we don't have data clearly because we don't have illegal dumping data, is that it may overlap with truck traffic and industrial land use. We kind of looked into this, and per our conversations with the state agencies, it doesn't seem like there's any statewide data available on illegal dumping, and nothing really kind of, there's very little chance that we're going to get data on this that is consistent in a statewide way. I feel like I'm saying the same phrase often with this, and that makes sense, right? When you're trying to make a statewide definition of something, a lot of data points are not going to be as good as they would be in the hyperlocal instance. So I would recommend we monitor the data for that, just because it can really have implications for health. Okay, I'm going to cover these both here. Lead water in schools. There are no data available for this. I will note that when fixtures do test positive, the schools are required to immediately shut it down and fix the problem and replace the fixtures. That is probably why there are no data that are currently flagged for this, because it's just kind of a, okay, you tested positive, let's fix it. What makes me kind of think about this is an interesting one for us to, I don't know, lead in schools matters a lot. It also talks to about the fact that if you find lead in schools, it's probably an older building. There's lots of other things going on. And that's part of the reason why I think high tax aid might be a better metric for some of this. There's no data for lead water in schools, but if we can get a list of high tax aid, that might be showing lower income schools less ability to respond to issues like lead in their water. So I would recommend dropping this one just because I don't see any chance of us getting data on this that is consistent across the state. Lead in water service lines, there is no statewide there's no statewide data for this. But there is some work going on with community water systems to gather some of this information. So I think this is worthwhile looking at and monitoring in the years to come to see whether there's some way that we can collate this data. If there's a way that these communities are going to start doing this in a consistent way, that we can maybe look at this as a potential indicator in the future.
Hey, Alex, this is Sonal. Can you remind me if we have lead in paint as an indicator included? I know generally, maybe Neil can speak to some of the statewide data, but I know generally we don't have like great numbers statewide on lead poisoning, and that makes it difficult. I'm just wondering, did we go down that route already? I just don't remember.
We totally went down that route, and we ended up including housing vintage. So like the proportion of houses that are 1960 or earlier. And that is the best proxy that I have ever seen, and this is across the country, for lead in paint, is to look at housing vintage. And so we did include that because it's housing vintage in a lot of ways actually gives you a lot of information, not just about lead, but other, like, you know, older homes need a lot more work. And if that in combination with income can exacerbate quite a lot of, you know, issues with health and safety and comfort. So we have housing vintage was the best we could do, but we did discuss it and there was no statewide direct measure of lead paint.
Thanks, Alex. And then on that indicator, does that include houses that may or may not have received extensive renovations since?
Fortunately not. And so this is one of those where it's a rough measure, so you kind of cover a little bit, but you know, I like to think of this, the DAC criteria, and why we include 45 indicators rather than say just 10 is that we're trying to like paint the picture with multiple layers and cover things in a way that allows us to get a holistic picture without being able to have the perfect data. We have some, but it won't cover everything.
And I would just add too, this is Neil, that we'll continue to look at the childhood lead data that we do have, and if we can get a census tract level indicator in the future, we would. But in the past, when we've talked to that program, we haven't had it. So it's another one that we're monitoring and working with that program to see what we can do.
Yeah, and I think in a subsequent meeting, what I'll do is actually take one of the things that we've been thinking a lot about, and Shannon's going to talk to you about later today, is that we're going to have this review process, and we want to get a process in place now so that, you know, it's not just this comment period and then we're done, that we're really thinking critically about the data indicators that we currently have, like housing vintage, and thinking, okay, what we're trying to get at is lead there primarily. So is there a better measure in the future that we can add or include? And so we're monitoring a lot of those. So next time, I think I'll take the list of current indicators and tell you what we're thinking about and what we're worried about. We've talked a lot about those, you know, in the year prior, but it's good to get a refresh on that. Okay, two more. Here we've got abandoned buildings. And this was trying to get at a metric of pollution and economic vulnerability. The city of Rochester has good data on this, but there are no statewide available data. This is, again, one of those elements and areas where we want to monitor the availability in the future. Low life expectancy, a good health impact indicator. I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole on this one because I was like, wait, well, we have premature deaths. What is the difference in the definition? And I think what we're looking at here in this comment is two sides of one coin. If you look at the definition of premature death, it's the years of potential life lost before age 75 per 100,000 population. It's a 1-year estimate, or at least that's the definition I could find. Life expectancy is the at birth estimate of the number of years a person is expected to live. So they're pretty similar in some ways, and I'm not sure that low life expectancy is going to give us any additional, say, variability that we can capture in information here. So I'm going to recommend that we drop it because I think premature death, which we have data for, as opposed to low life expectancy where we do not have data for and cannot find it, that we drop this rather than trying to monitor availability. It looks like we just have what we've got and it's pretty similar. We also identified 3 different elements here, concentration of heat vulnerable jobs, cost of living, and gentrification. These were not flagged for inclusion in the criteria, but rather as different elements for long-term monitoring of the unintended consequences and how the DAC criteria is doing long-term. And so we're working to identify these. These are really complex concepts like gentrification. Cost of living is a pretty straightforward one, but concentration of heat vulnerable jobs is not straightforward. So I'm going to table these for now, but these all are going to require some study and creation of these metrics. What I'd like to do is work on these after the kind of voting on the current criteria and then set some metrics in at the very beginning so that then we can start seeing any possible changes by census tract for them. But I think gentrification is going to take a while and it's going to require some study. So stay tuned for these. Any questions on this? So
I
this
just want to say
yeah.
something about gentrification in terms of its relationship to climate. And I think it's important that you include some analysis of what happens when social cohesion is disrupted to vulnerable and frontline communities. And I think people think about gentrification a little differently, but there is a relationship between displacement and people being more vulnerable and more likely to die from extreme weather events.
Okay. Yeah. From extreme events. We'll look into that. Now, I would say that gentrification in particular is something that we have discussed, before we've discussed gentrification as an issue that kind of in tandem with the DAC criteria is something that we should look at. And in this case, I think the unintended consequences of this and metrics that we can create here are something that I would like to talk to you guys in the future once we've voted on the criteria for this year to really create a metric and be thoughtful about it. So I think we need to, particularly if we're going to, by the end of February, vote on the criteria for this year, that we need to focus there. But gentrification is something that, boy, it's going to take a lot of discussion and thought into how to create it, a lot like creating the DAC criteria. It's not a simple metric. Okay, I am going to stop sharing this. And actually, no, I'm just going to take this and go through the methodological components. Everyone good if we move on to methods? Okay, I will say I'm going to distribute the Excel sheet to all of you after this call. And what I would love is if you disagree with the recommendations or if you have any other notes and comments, please put that in there. It will be on our SharePoint thingy. Please put comments in there so that we are aware of or capturing your thoughts. I think for right now, we have what we have, but that long-term monitoring is, I think, really important. Okay, methodological comments. We found 52 of 52 substantive methodological recommendations in the comments. And we've reviewed that list with you before, but when asking questions, I remember Eddie saying like, well, what do they really mean? Sometimes the methods kind of comments were just do this, there was nothing there, but we did actually try to review all the comments again to make sure that we got all the context. So I want to share now the methods part. Lana, how are we doing on time?
We're good. It's almost 1 o'clock.
Okay. Me here, I will make this nice and big. Okay, so just to orient you to this crazy worksheet, last time we talked about it and we went through these different 66 or 52 or whichever number it is now comments, we put a 1 by the ones we really wanted to look into and discuss. But we actually went through all of them and I think it's worthwhile looking at them. I will mention this is just like that before, Eddie, this is like the calculation change or different calculation approach versus the change, review, or delete indicators. There's geographic recommendations on how to, expand buffers. There's weighting. There's also standardizing across the state or including non-statewide data. So I want to go through every single one of these and talk through them. We are probably not going to have a full amount of time to do everything here, but I do want us to get through what we can do. And in this Excel sheet, I've also flagged a next step for us. And in here, you'll see that there's a kind of integrate into continuous review, flag for monitoring, clarifying the documentation. There are a couple that I want to discuss with you in particular. So let's hop to it. That's what this looks like. Can everyone see this okay? So I'm going to wrap this text so that we can see it. Consider sliding scale over percentages. This comment was getting at the fact that we are using percentiles to normalize all the data. And I would say that that type of change in the DAC scoring criteria is not feasible because we're allowing scoring across New York State and trying to do kind of, how can I say it, like provide rural representation and integrate all these different elements into one criteria. Sliding scale won't work because of that. And here's my comment. So I'm recommending we don't go forward with it. I'm just going to have you stop me as I go because I don't want to lose time here. Create a threshold for the tract to be considered if it has a significant proportion of eligible households. The inclusion of individual criteria makes this unnecessary. Should individual criteria be eliminated, then this would be something we could look into. Emphasize vulnerabilities over burdens. This is a comment that was something many commenters had, which is something we also observed when we were ground truthing, that most of the time when you were all ground truthing and you were describing what created or made a disadvantaged community, almost all the time it was talking about the vulnerabilities as opposed to the burdens. If we were to change this methodologically, it would mean that we would have to change how we add up the two different component scores. Because right now we're multiplying them. We can't weight one higher than the other. It's just going to double the score. So if you all think that we should emphasize vulnerabilities over burdens, say weight that component higher, then we have to change to an addition approach, which kind of takes away the theory of that kind of multiplicative effect of environmental burdens and economic vulnerabilities, socio-demographic vulnerabilities kind of playing off each other and exacerbating one another.
Alex, can you explain it a little bit better? I mean, just clearer, because from my perspective, you know, the most vulnerable communities also have a disparate share of the burdens, but burdens don't impact everyone the same way because of the legacy of toxic harm and historical harm. So what I wouldn't want is to weigh in favor of, at the expense of people who have had to endure that for generations. So I just want to understand it a little better.
Yeah, so I think the best way for me to do this is to draw pictures. So bear with me while I draw pictures. And so right now, what we do, we have burdens, and we're multiplying that by vulnerability. And basically what we're taking is this multiplicative effect of, okay, the burden score we have for that census tract, and we multiply that. And here, the vulnerability side, and then we get, in essence, what you have been describing, which is the concept that there are some very vulnerable people, but if they are not experiencing high burdens, their experience is, and almost what you would say for a disadvantaged community within this environmental perspective, they're not scoring nearly as highly as if they had burdens as well. So that is the concept here. Now there is the idea here that, well, maybe we should add instead. They don't play off each other the same way, right? But maybe then we can weight vulnerabilities. So people who are very vulnerable but may not have as many burdens would still score higher and may be considered a DAC. And so that's the concept that that comment is going after, which is saying weight vulnerabilities more because they matter more.
Can I ask a related question, Alex?
Yeah.
I think what I'm trying to get at is sort of similar to what Elizabeth is asking. I'm wondering about two things. The correlation between what we're seeing in the burden bucket and what we're seeing in the vulnerability bucket, like to what extent do those overlap? And then would it be correct or incorrect to think of burdens as sort of more historical and vulnerabilities as more future focused?
I would say vulnerabilities are very locked in the current time.
Okay, so present.
Burden,
Yep, okay.
present time, yeah. Burdens both have a historical aspect because we have redlining. We have a lot of different components in there that speak to historical discrimination, but they also have things like riverine and the oceany flooding. You guys are getting me in my special word day. And in this case, those are all projections for the future. So the burdens component is a very complex component. And just to kind of go back there, because it's very well worth looking through and trying to see this, right? So we've got vehicle traffic density, diesel truck, particulate matter, benzene concentration, land use, remediation, so we've got power generation, and then we've got potential climate change risks. And this is double weighted within this component. And that's extreme heat projections. That's flooding in the coastal areas, flooding inland areas projected again, agricultural land and vegetative cover, and driving times to hospitals and urgent care. And then we've got within the vulnerabilities, we have, in this case, income, education, race, ethnicity, and language, health impacts and sensitivities, and house, energy, and communications. Where is historical redlining under race and ethnicity and language? So I would say very much present in the vulnerabilities, but I thought we had originally had redlining actually in the burdens, so that's why I was remembering that. But in this case, this is the backward-looking historical component too, whereas this is also very present, but then the potential climate change risks are very forward-looking. Also, Abby, to talk through your questions, I had anticipated and kind of wondered about how different factor scores were correlating with one another. You guys are going to get more stats 101 from me here. But big numbers mean high correlations. With the exception of the two red ones, everything is statistically significant here, but we have a lot of power. What I will say this is that the burden score for climate change risks, that future-looking one, is often negatively correlated with a lot of the other things, particularly the different vulnerability metrics. So when someone is scoring, when a census tract is scoring really highly in low income, say they're a very low income tract, they are here, and then climate change risks right here. They're scoring lower in the climate change risks. This is, again, these are correlations, right? So there's lots of data points here, and it's a whole like thing, but there's not as much of a relationship here. So what that tells me, climate change risk, that factor, and then generally all of the burdens factors are less related, with exception to this factor score right here, the race ethnicity one, and the environmental exposures. This is where highly correlated things are happening. In other words, people have been historically discriminated by only being able to live in housing that is very much next to environmental exposed areas. That's what this is telling me.
Alex, if I can kind of maybe paraphrase what I think I just heard, is that yes, they are capturing different things. So there's not overlap, so we should kind of like dismiss one over the other. I am wondering if maybe some of that lack of overlap is due to, like we've talked about before, like, on Long Island, super rich people, but living right next to the coast.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you have any sense of to what extent that is like bubbling up, or that specific kind of?
We can look at that and kind of start looking at the different, say, quartiles for these different factors and then kind of overlaying them with maps and look at that. When we looked at that last time, it was very much that, which is, you know, there are some very rich areas that are right on the ocean front and have a lot of issues. But there are also just other things I think that are interesting here is that even when you think about, let's see here, you've got land use proximity is not that related to climate risks or environmental exposures, right? So, sorry, go ahead, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I think this is not the climate working group. This is the climate justice working group. So if in our community, privileged people move next to the environmental burdens, they have a choice to do that. They don't have a history of health disparities. And by the way, the health disparities don't just come from toxic exposure. They come from a legacy of racism. And we take those with us everywhere we go. And so I think my view is the charge of this group is to the burden without the vulnerability does not speak to justice. And so so my concern is to make sure that we figure out how to ensure that that is captured. And I'm glad you brought up the redlining because that speaks to what I'm trying to communicate. I don't know if I'm being clear.
See it.
I don't
You
know
are
if I'm
being
being clear. Okay.
I think you're being very clear. I think what I would like to do is come next time with, I'm going to try. Now, this is a big departure in how we were calculating things to do this additional component. And the theory behind kind of environmental justice led us and other statewide, so California uses this multiplicative approach as well, because what we wanted to do was make sure that the vulnerabilities, like it's the interaction, right? The exacerbation of one, when someone lives in a region that is burdened and they're vulnerable, they are super disadvantaged, as opposed to if you add these together, you may lose some of that interplay. And so that's kind of where this is coming from and the idea between the multiplicative one. But, you know, I could see us talking through this being also within the heart of kind of environmental justice as well, right? Because you're trying to show that vulnerabilities have a lot more kind of play. And so when burdens are added to that, it can be affected. But vulnerabilities, if you're very vulnerable, those burdens are gonna count a lot for you. So it's really hard to articulate, it's really hard to mess with, but I think we can go beyond this. And I remember last year, Amanda and I having this big debate and trying to figure out how we could do this and change this in any way. Let me try it again and see whether we can do this addition as a methodological change, and then I can show you both maps. And then you can be like, okay, that feels right, or this doesn't feel right.
Alex, this is Sonal. I'm sorry, we can't raise our hand. We're figuring that out. But just to, Elizabeth's point, I think what I'm feeling is that we're missing the sort of the resiliency component to how climate and environmental change affects people. It's about who's more resilient to climate impacts or environmental impacts. And I think that's the question of vulnerability. And it just makes me think, I'm like, what indicators do we have that accurately calculates for resiliency? And I really think income and race are the only things. And I'm wondering are there other indicators? I don't know the answer to this. Are there other indicators that might help us get at some of that resiliency piece that maybe we're just missing more? To me, all of the demographic, like the page you're on now, all these demographic characteristics is more of the resiliency side, but maybe we're missing some stuff there.
Yeah, there could be. And, this is where we don't even have it on the prioritized list, but COVID data actually could, or the one nice thing it could do is actually help pinpoint some of these kind of resiliency factors. So it's something that we can look into, and I don't think it will be ready anytime soon for this coming vote, but it's something we should look into. So I'll make a note of that because, Sonal, I think that speaks to what you're talking about, or at least we can tinker with it and see whether that is there. I would also say the resiliency, this health impacts and sensitivities, that's a big one for resiliency, I would say. But and then the housing is the idea that if you are in a home or in a place where you can't be resilient because the infrastructure is just not there to be resilient.
So I think to that point, do we need to explore weighting those also?
Yeah, although I will say this, so a lot of the weighting comments that we saw are hard, right? So there was a lot of weight race less, weight race more, weight like, but what you're doing there is pushing a tiny needle, like tiny pebble, because you're weighting within this factor. And then this factor has equal weight to these other factors. And so we can tinker with the weight, and we did do that a while back, but it gets really messy really quickly if we start tinkering with it. But you're not wrong that there could be things in here that matter more, and we should really talk through those and weight them more. But I am going to kind of talk through kind of the idea here, resiliency.
Abby, was your hand, is this a legacy hand or is your hand still up?
Just real quick, kind of on like, I don't know, is this methodologically feasible? Could we have a threshold in the vulnerabilities? Like if a community is above a certain threshold for income and probably having race in there too, that they're just basically disqualified?
You know, we talked about that, almost like a reverse individual criteria kind of thing, and dismissed it, I think, mostly on implementation complication issues, but I can dig out my notes from that, Abby, and try to see what we can find. I am wary of doing that, but mostly because, say we add an indicator, we do it that way, we try to kind of add some data points. What we would be doing is actually adding the mirror force of what we have here as far as like low income and things like that, because it's a census tract, not individual level. And if we treated it as an individual level, then that could get really tricky. So let me do some thinking about it. I see New York City has their hand up. They figured it out.
Alex, some of this feels a little counterintuitive. By the way, I want to echo, I think where someone was talking about the resiliency stuff, I think that answers, or at least starts edging towards part of what's been making me uncomfortable about how the indicators interplay and where they ultimately land in designating DACs. Part of what's been troubling me for a while is exactly that. Like if we end up putting out criteria that says, the South Shore of Long Island is a DAC, but Hollis, Queens is not, it feels to me like we're doing something wrong. And when I look at, again, and this may be counterintuitive, I've always thought that when you talk about burdens and vulnerabilities, that the more you emphasize vulnerabilities, the less people of color are actually captured. So maybe I'm misunderstanding, because it sounds like you were actually saying the opposite a few minutes ago. But part of what's bothering me is that when you talk about, again, I know there's a climate justice working group, and Elizabeth, thank you so much for reminding us all that there's a very particular perspective, right? But what bothers me is that, a lot of us that have been doing this for a while know that with environmental justice, that, race is sometimes a higher indicator even than income. And I'm just worried about us leaving behind some of our Black community, populations that under normal circumstances would have viewed as a DAC. So I guess what I'm wondering is if you could speak to that, the notion of what is it that, I think this is where we're going, but I just want to put it flatly. What would we need to do with this criteria in order to capture more specifically Black community DAC populations that we may be missing? and I may be asking an impossible question, and if so, I will retract, but just from a common sense perspective, that's what's been bugging me for the last couple of weeks about what the DAC is doing, what the DAC criteria is doing.
Well, it's worthwhile talking about always, frankly, in this case. One of the things that we did, which was a big departure and raised some eyebrows, I think, because people were saying, well, why don't you just look at people of color and use that rather than separating out different races? And then also that it's people, there were some comments that were saying that you should not weight Black and Latino over other disadvantaged areas or different races in the criteria. Now we did all that because we're trying to get at the historical discrimination, particularly of these two groups, and by double weighting Black and Latino and also having historical redlining in here, we are able to capture and almost kind of like add more weight to those groups within this factor. Now, as with everything in here, it is very much a choice in what we do and what direction we want to do. And that's part of the reason why I leaned so heavily last year on the ground truthing and making sure that what you guys felt like was real, because there's literally no one else in New York State defining this the way that we are defining it. So we have nothing to like compare to. We have some metrics now, like end zone, but they're not the same. What you're trying to do is different. And so that's why, well, what this group is trying to do is different. And that's why we have to kind of lean on your experience and thought and look at those maps together. And I will say this, I think we do a good job, not a great job, of capturing and making sure that we are not leaving behind Black and Latino residents. But because we have all these other concepts, both here and also in the burdens area, that inevitably we're going to leave some groups behind, or at least some regions behind, in addition to, say, the 25%, 35% kind of cutoff.
Can I weigh in, Alex?
Yeah.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Eddie, I think to answer your question that you had specifically about the communities, predominantly Black communities that may be left behind, I think what we've seen from the comments on that were some of the prioritization suggestions that came up earlier in the meeting. Things like considering low birth weight, looking at proximity to airports, and there are a couple of other things that came from residents in those communities for consideration, and we have talked about those previously, as recently as earlier in this meeting. But maybe another thing we could do is what Alex is prompting us through right now, which is what are the methodological considerations that we should consider here, and how do those different scenarios play out on the map in capturing some of those the communities that you referenced, Eddie. And so maybe as a next step, we can take a look at a couple of different scenarios and provide those to the working group at a future meeting.
I'm always down with that. We have the whole setup. If you guys all remember, the whole ground truthing overlaid with the two different scenarios, and we can tinker with weighting and inclusion of different kind of components of this. So I think that those are all very important to review, and they do align with the comments in this thought. Again, kind of going back to how do we deal with the kind of how do we combine burdens and vulnerabilities. The EJ theory, and we did discuss this last year, to kind of have this multiplicative thing is to kind of show that if you are very vulnerable and have burdens, you're going to have more exposure here. But on the flip side, this also, if you have slightly less vulnerabilities, but have a high burden score, but you have some vulnerabilities, you also are going to score highly. So we can investigate this also as an alternative scenario where we're using some kind of additive approach that then almost weights vulnerabilities higher. But I make no promises. I don't know if it's going to work, and I think it will be interesting to see what we can do. Okay, I want to go through some of the other ones because methods matter, as we have all been discussing. There's some NA ones that I'm just going to go through here, but include NYCHA housing and even in non-DACs. Now, this was a New York City recommendation, and with the inclusion of individual criteria, it really doesn't have much, you know, it doesn't really necessarily help at all. But if individual criteria are taken out, then this is something that we can be thinking about. These I kind of love because I actually wholeheartedly agree with them. Make the formula simpler, make the tool simpler, and review the scoring methodology. And these elements, these three, and kind of just as the discussion we were talking about, right? We have 45 indicators. We're talking about adding maybe potentially more. We should probably think about streamlining some of this as well. So that's not going to happen by the end of February for the vote, but it's something that we need to integrate into like the continuous review process. Separate qualification for Indigenous lands was a comment. Indigenous lands are included separately. Use categorical thresholds as well as geographic. That is kind of like an individual one, and we have that for Indigenous lands and low-income customers or clients or residents. Wow, brain. And then now we're getting into the change review delete indicators, and we've got change landfill indicator to percent of the area. Right now it is not a percent of area of the tract landfill. It's more of a, here's a landfill, there's a buffer around the landfill area, and we count that. Change to 60% AMI. We discussed this in the prior meeting. We're going to keep the income measures as they are. Discontinue agricultural land use. I want to flag this one and discuss it at some point, not today, but you know, one comment was like, well, why is it there? And we were trying to get at farming and potential heat change in farming and lots of things here as far as also different pesticides and all the things like that, but something worth discussing. Discontinue use of benzene concentration variable. Again, we can discuss and flag for indicator monitoring if there's something better. Right now, it's the best we have. Okay. There was a lot of comments about diesel fuel. This was, Elizabeth, one of those, and they were largely directed to the scoping plan. So we're not going to do anything with those comments. We're reevaluating areas or reevaluate areas where there could be double counting. And we discussed this kind of as far as overlap and emphasis. And one of the things that this is double counting is, say, like the fact that we have percent Latino double weighted and percent Black double weighted within that factor. And we can clarify the documentation because where we are double weighting things, there's very deliberate reasons for it. So I just want to clarify the documentation there. Reevaluate separation of race variables. I wanted to bring this up because, yeah.
So sorry, quick question. The doubling of the weight, I'm just trying to, again, we've been doing this, I was gonna say, feels like years. It's actually been years. When we decided to double the weight, could you explain a little bit what the thinking was? And I'm wondering whether tripling the weight may get us where I'd like us better to be.
Yeah, although I think what we might want to do is actually think about race, like not necessarily tripling within that factor, but maybe weighting that factor more itself. So rather than tripling the percent Black in that factor, because then it kind of like takes away from limited English proficiency and other things like that, but rather just make that race factor more important. So I can tinker with both of those because, you know, yeah, we can talk about it and see what we can do. And to that point also, there was a comment, we deliberately went away from people of color as a metric and individually kind of took them out and have them separately measured so that we could weight them and also have more resolution into what is going into that factor. But we can also look at people of color. Maybe that would change things in the right direction or not. I don't think it would, but I also am trying to be a scientist.
I have to go, Alex. Can I just say something before I leave?
Absolutely.
People of color is such a broad term.
Huh.
And even among Latinos, they're not all of African and indigenous ancestry.
Yeah.
And so I just think that we need to look at historically marginalized communities and communities that are vulnerable. And, I think we need to be real careful with language because it's really packed and it's not the same. There are people who are not part of historical marginalized communities, and then there are people that are using the term people of color, like that term Hispanic, which is packed, like you, Alex, could be a Hispanic. All you need is a Spanish surname, right? So anyway, I know it's complicated because that's not the way that governance captures data, but I think we need to be sensitive to the fact that some people are more vulnerable than others because of a legacy of extraction and toxic exposure. Thank you so much. I got to head out, but I have a doctor's appointment, but peace. Thank you.
Yeah, Elizabeth, thank you. And speaking for myself as someone who lived and grew up in Argentina,
There you
and
go.
come on. I mean, like, I have so much privilege with my skin color, and I do not have that historical racism. I'm still a Latina. So how does that enter into it? So that's why we did this, right?
Look at that. I didn't even know that. So there, you
You
just
did
made my
it?
point. You just made my point.
Yeah. There
Yeah.
you go.
All right. Peace.
Peace.
Take care.
So this is why we didn't use the people of color kind of larger frame, but I wanted to bring it up. This is a comment. We can look at it again if you are interested, but I flagged it as something we should discuss. So please let me know if this is a go, no go. Right now I'm seeing like 12 different variants of things, so I want to narrow things down so that we're just looking at a few for the next meeting with a goal of trying to get this voted on soon.
Alex, this is Sonal. I do think it sounds like there's a lot to discuss there, so I'm just putting in my vote to talk about it.
Okay.
And there's a lot of, at least, I don't know, everything I say is based on how much I learn about New York City versus statewide, so I don't know the difference of what's available in this sense, but there's a lot of work that New York City has done to document health, income, other vulnerability statistics based on races, and they're not only the very broad landscape of how we define race. So there might be some good examples out there of how that's been a little bit better delineated, at least in New York City, that we could probably look at.
Okay, that's good to know. So I'm going to make this a color and flag it so that we are going to discuss it and look into it. Go. Okay, remove race indicator. We discussed this before, and the CLCPA includes race as a factor. So I put it in the NA there for now. Review driving times and homes built before 1960. And I'm going to flag this for indicator monitoring. Again, the homes built before 1960, that housing vintage kind of component, that's to get at that is to get at lead. Driving times is the driving times to, say, emergency to hospitals, and we have the data we have, but we can continue to monitor it. That's the same kind of with all of these. Review the methodologies. We're going to flag for indicator monitoring and look at the different methodologies as we go. Right now, with the data we have, is the best we can get. And it's kind of, we worked with industry experts to create these. And so I'm loath to change them until something changes or we get better at doing something, or we get better data. Now I'm going to go back into some of these NA ones, but I want to make sure that you are aware of these main comments. There's a lot of area median income ones, include impacts outside of this New York State. That's a no-go. Buffer areas. Now, there's quite a few buffer area or census tract versus census block, as I alluded to earlier. These are really cool ideas and valid because a community sometimes stretches into other areas and say part of that community may be in one census tract and they are not a DAC because of how that census tract is spread out. But that community is the disadvantaged community. And yet, because of the fact that we've kind of had to make these decisions to geographically get data and look at this, it makes buffer zones and the flexibility between blocks and tracks nearly impossible to do. What that would require is a lot of maintenance of multiple data sets and kind of combining across data sets. And I would strongly recommend not doing it. But if at some point we can get better resolution data, say at the block group level, then we can reassess. But until that happens, until we know that we can get good, solid data at a block group level, we can't do much about this. Okay. Now we've got make rural areas eligible. Okay, keep going. Burdens across geographic borders. Outside of tracks. Review proportion. Block level. Consider data sets that do not have statewide coverage to better represent vulnerabilities facing communities. We've discussed this in the past, and I think it's one of those I want to flag for kind of future consideration. Right now, we've tried to include, I think the only data source that we have that is different is historical redlining. We have statewide data on it, but it is only an urban metric. It is not a non-urban metric. But it is also so important that we all kind of looked at it and said, this is important. There could be other areas that we could start considering and looking at this, but it's something I want to flag for kind of future consideration and discussion. Specific kind of data ones here. And here we get into the weighting discussion. And all of these different weights are things that I can bring forth to you and discuss next time as far as, okay, well, what does it look like if there is, say, we multiply premature deaths by 2 or add limited English proficiency by 2 instead. And I'm not sure, a lot of those are tiny, tiny changes within a factor. They're not going to make huge differences. I do want to talk about population density. This is a good comment. And there's a particularly really good comment from the village of Curious Joel. And they were talking about how their community is very, very, very dense and has a high population density. And it's something that because of how we're using census tracts are oddly at least trying to balance population. And so population density is something that we could add, but it may not work very well just because census tracts are what they are. For on average, census tracts in New York State have about 3,900 residents. I think the largest one, at least with 2010 census tracts, was 17,000, and small ones, basically, there are some census tracts that have no population, no one lives there. But across all of ours, for the most part, you've got, say, 2,000 to 4,000 residents in most census tracts, and that's the metric we're using to kind of designate things. So the population density is a tough one for us to try to tackle, but it's something we can look into if you would like. Okay, so then there's more increasing weights for
Alex,
economic. Oh, yeah.
you have
Yes,
a hand up.
I just don't understand why. What would adding population density do for us?
I don't think it would do much, but there was a pretty interesting, this is the comment from Curious Joel, the community. And let's see, where did they have this? It's like a 5-page comment, so it's kind of big. Let's see if I can find.
Alex or Doctora, quick question. As we're looking at this, I want to make sure I'm understanding. Did the comment from that particular village say the population density should or should not be? Sorry?
Yeah, they wanted it so that you could high population density tracks should be counted more. But I'm still trying to figure out how on earth to actually do it. So in this case, you know, they have, let's see here, population density as an indicator represents potential risks to the community, environmental health, and community economic disparities are pronounced in densely populated areas. That's completely true. But the population density factor that we could create because we're using census tracts is what's going to be really tricky, and I'm not sure how we could do that. So that's kind of where I go back and forth on this.
Alex, this is Abby. Is it correct to also believe that there are advantages to living in dense communities? I mean, I think there are.
Yeah, I think there definitely are. I think it's a balance, right? And that could be one of those where I'm not sure it's worth looking into in this with this group and for this, you know, kind of criteria. But there could be one of those kind of balance points where if you're this dense, it's bad. If you're this dense, you know, I don't know. It's definitely something we could think through. But again, because we're in census tract land, census tracts are trying to keep population within that tract balanced. If not, it splits. And we now have 2020 census tract data. We're kind of got the best data we have. But I wanted to bring it up because it's a comment and I think there's some valid points that they make. Any other thoughts? Okay. So there's some other weighting ones. We're applying multipliers for vehicles mile traveled, population vulnerability. So this is, again, that idea that in that component score for vulnerabilities, make that way higher. And then so many other ones. So I think a lot of people have different perspectives on what we should weight versus not. And I don't want us to feel like, you know, like we need to discuss them and then choose which ones that feel most important to you. So as far as next steps for this, what I'd like to do is I have in this document right here for you all, both the indicator updates and the methodological updates with comments and the next steps. And I'd like for you all to provide comments and thoughts in this document if you have them, so that we can have kind of the next steps that we need to take. I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint. One thing I will say for next week, 2 weeks from now, I forget, Alana, when we're meeting next, very soon, I'm going to try the 9th
of February.
Okay, so in 2 weeks, we're going to work with a team to try to figure out how we can change the scoring so that you can see differences here. And then I see New York City, just 1 second. And then also to try to look at how to weight certain indicators or factors more or less to provide some other scenarios as well. So that's kind of, insofar as kind of based on the methodological comments so far, those are the ones that are really popping up in our discussion. Okay, New York City.
Yeah, Alex, just to add to that bucket is kind of what I had ways at the beginning of the meeting, and I think this is part of the calculation you're gonna mess with around the burdens and the vulnerabilities. But how are we resolving that we do have a higher proportion of populations covered as compared to the 35% minimum number? And, that being something that we should go back to and talk about in terms of how we're weighting population. So that's just on the docket for, I think, one of the bigger conversation pieces.
Okay.
And I think that ties into the burdens and the vulnerabilities methodological conversation, because it would change the map significantly.
Yeah. Okay, vulnerability, like component scores. So yes, there's that. And then at the end, we talked about weighting kind of vulnerability factors or indicators for resiliency and representation of. Okay. So this is kind of the next steps that I see for our team to come back to you on the 9th with something based on these comments. Does everyone agree with that? Okay, so one thing I've alluded to, by the way, I don't like silence as acquiescence. So if you guys are like, do you agree that these are the priorities? Please say yes or no.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
This is Abby. I would say of all of them, what Eddie said earlier about it just doesn't feel right to include some super rich community and leave out others. To me, that is the biggest, so whichever of these kind of touches on that would be where I'd love to see us put our.
New York City had your hand up? Or is that legacy?
I think that's legacy.
Okay.
Cool. Okay. Thank you all for your vocal support. It's really helpful sometimes, especially when I can't see all your faces anymore, so I can't see you nod. Okay. Throughout this discussion, I've been talking about how this whole, like, we should flag things for future monitoring. One thing that I think is so important in all of this is that we're not done. We're never going to be done. This is something that is a living criteria. And while you may vote for the upcoming year, the legislation does require us to update this. And so Shannon has been doing some thinking on this, and I want to hand it over to her, and I will just continue to share. But Shannon, you want to chat?
Sure. Thank you, Alex. So yeah, as Alex just mentioned, we are starting to work on the plan for ongoing assessment of the disadvantaged communities definition. And we will discuss this with you all in greater detail in the future. But for right now, we really just wanted to provide a high-level overview of what the plan will include and hear any immediate thoughts you might have on what's important to you in this respect. And I do also want to mention that we are planning to include this plan in what you will vote on in February. So you will be seeing more details in the future, and you will have a chance to vote on the plan. So in addition to including detail on how we'll continue to collaborate moving forward across teams throughout the upcoming years, we're using this plan to document how we will monitor developments in other regions and incorporate that into our review. Just so we're planning to keep an eye on what's happening in other jurisdictions and in kind of the DAC science, if you want to use that term, and we'll bring things we learn there forward to the group. We'll also include our plan for how we will track and monitor data for updating existing indicators and how we will test that updated data will detail how we plan to monitor data sources available for the prioritized indicators that Alex went through earlier and potentially other new indicators, along with how we'll test including those indicators and how we'll present the findings of that to the working group. And then we'll also be getting into how we'll track unintended consequences of the definition through continued ground truthing and some of those long-term monitoring indicators that Alex talked about. So I understand this is just kind of a high-level overview, but we wanted to share this. And if there's anything that's top of mind for any of you all as something that's important to think about as we think through this plan, we'd like to open it up to hear those thoughts now. Yes, someone has a hand raised, but I'm not sure where. The New York City boardroom.
It's me, Shannon. It's Eddie. Quick question. It may be tangential and not directly to the point of this particular slide, but in our last meeting, we had talked about how the debt criteria will be applied when federal money starts to flow. And I thought I saw in the minutes that there was some complication because Justice 40 has its own criteria that need to be met in terms of where money gets directed. And of course, it's not completely aligned for obvious reasons, most of it being race. But I'm wondering if you all, and if this is not this slide, if we could maybe address this question later, but before we hop off. But I'm just wondering if there's been any progress in terms of figuring out how to use the DAC definition and how it's going to interplay with Justice 40 complications. It's more for, actually, it's more of a question for DEC and I sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, hey Eddie, it's Chris. I don't know if everybody can hear me, but maybe a couple things to flag on that. So as the federal agencies are starting to program those dollars, the first thing that they're doing is putting out RFIs, like a request for information, to basically help inform what the funding opportunity announcements will look like. And so that's kind of one area where, we've been kind of flagging, we need to ensure that there's alignment and, where possible, deference to state frameworks, right? So we want to make sure that we are able to, not create additional burdens in terms of the administration of these funds. So that's kind of like, one thing that we've, begun to do. And then there's still kind of additional work that we have to, discuss what this looks like in terms of implementation, with federal dollars. So, I suppose one of the things that will become more apparent is, when federal agencies start to put out their funding opportunity notices, that'll be, they'll be kind of talking about the rules about how they expect to apply Justice 40 and, what the interplay potentially would be with state, frameworks. But, we are still working with colleagues at the federal level to kind of have that discussion. So nothing more to report out on that other than it's coming up, right now in the RFIs that agencies are putting out.
One follow-up, Chris, maybe for our next climate justice working group meeting, if you have the capacity, maybe you guys could come in and talk a little bit more, because I hear what you're saying, but from an advocate's perspective, I have no clue about how we're supposed to monitor the state's decisions to ensure that we're making the 35 to 40% commitment real. And so I'm not getting that from this particular explanation, but maybe for a future climate justice working group meeting.
Yeah, we'll take that back and come back with, more insight as we have it. Yeah.
Thanks. And I see Alex made a note on the slide, so we'll be considering also how that fits into the plan for ongoing monitoring and assessment. Let's see, I see a hand in Region 8.
Yeah, so this is Abby. Just the information that Chris has presented previously about the benefits and investments framework, I would want to see kind of explicitly be something that we're keeping an eye on how it's playing out and whether it's working.
Yep, that makes sense. Anything else?
Is there a time, hi, this is Elizabeth from Department of Labor. Is there a timeline for, it says we have to meet once, but is it by a certain time we have to, that those things have to be done? Or is it as needed?
I think that's something we'll be figuring out in the plan and discussing with the group. Yeah, I think as it says there, we'll meet no less than annually, so we have to meet at least once a year. But we may very well decide that we'll want to meet more frequently, and that'll be something we'll be figuring out as we develop the plan.
Yep, absolutely. That's something that we'll discuss. I wanted to sort of hold off on that discussion until after we voted, but that is something that we definitely need to get together and talk about and more or less maybe informally vote on exactly what and how many meetings and what that looks like moving forward. So I wasn't going to bring this up, but I guess I can quickly. There will be meetings in March. Just in case everyone thought that once we voted, we'd be done for a while, we will have to meet in March just to, at the very least, go over that portion, so stay tuned. Great.
Lana, on that, I think it'd also be good to put on the agenda, maybe this is a March thing, is like, how are we getting the word out around the map being done? I just have had a lot of anecdotal comments to me about the need for better awareness work around the DAC map.
Sorry, so just knowledge around the DAC map or making sure that there's more public outreach on the DAC map? Is that what we're?
Yeah, just advertising when it's out, just advertising it to communities and making sure, how we can best disseminate that information.
And again, we can kind of opine on this a little bit further in March if you want, but there is a plan, at least for DEC, to have something along the lines of a roadshow on the disadvantaged communities criteria, something similar to what we did for the education sessions prior to during the hearing process. So we can definitely talk a little bit more about that and to what extent working group members want to be involved.
This will be an ongoing discussion that we have about this kind of continuous monitoring and improvement. I think this is going to be really important. We're not done, and we can always make this better. And I think we need to plan for how we're going to do that. And Shannon and I, being the data nerds we are, we have Excel sheets plans. So just you wait, but that's what's happening. Alana, I'm going to hand it over to you now to talk through kind of the work plan and the timeline.
Sure. I will say, Eddie, I know you have to go, so I can I'll email this around. So Eddie, if you want to go, don't feel like you have to stay for this particular portion because I know you have a meeting. So take off. Now that we have, seen a little bit more about, what we have left to do, and again, like I said, I will be sending this around in an email. This is not something that we necessarily need to vote on, but it's just something I want folks to have in their head. How are we feeling about our timeline? Right now, there is sort of a tentative schedule to vote on February 23rd. On the quote-unquote final criteria. Obviously, final, like I said, being in quotes because this is something we will revisit on an annual basis. But I want to sort of, just have us take our temperatures a little bit on how we feel about this date. Do we still feel that this is a good time to vote? Do we want to potentially push it back? Just something that we can discuss later, but I just want folks to sort of start to look at, the work we've done, where we have to go, and consider if the 23rd is still the date that we want. Like I said, nobody has the answer right now, just so that's in everybody's head. But this is the timeline moving forward. as it stands, same timeline as before. If there are any questions or concerns on the timeline, if anybody's feeling not great, we can discuss it, but just for folks to think about, and we can talk about it in our next meeting. Next slide. So items of interest, I wanted to just take a quick minute to talk about our community air monitoring. So just as a reminder, Climate Justice Working Group members are eligible to receive an Acclima Pro license. Just to look at the preliminary data for the air monitoring initiative. To begin the onboarding process, we definitely need to provide email addresses of every member of your organization who is going to access the platform. So if you could get that information either to me or to Margaret from our air team, that would be amazing. The training is going to be provided in 2 parts, and like I said, I'll send this all out in an email. Both sessions should last about an hour and 15 minutes. And the trainings are going to accommodate the groups over the next few weeks. So Acclima staff is available for sessions on Tuesdays from 3:30 to 5, Wednesdays from 4 to 5, and Fridays from 2 to 5 o'clock. I will send this around in the email for everybody, but just so that you have in your heads who you want to participate this, who's going to be accessing this information, and who's going to be trained. Like I said, we'll send out a follow-up email with a schedule for everybody. And you'll see right here, with regards to the air monitoring meetings, we've had 4 meetings so far to update on the process of the data collection. We're going to continue to explain how the data is being analyzed for each of the pollutants. There are meetings scheduled for the other 6 communities, and that's going to be held over the next few weeks. And we're going to continue to work with community advisory committees in each area for ongoing study purposes. So if you want any more information, you can see it's going to be available for anybody who is watching as an attendee. You can visit our website, www.dec.ny.gov/chemical/125320.html, and you can monitor the process. Let me see. Next slide. So I'm trying to go this really quickly because I know we're at the end. So for our next steps, our next 3 meetings will take place in February. It's going to be the 9th, the 16th, and the 23rd. They're all from 12 to 2. Until then, we're going to continue our analysis, working towards a consensus. And beyond that, I just want folks to keep our future work sort of off to the side in your head, like I said, for March. Does anybody have any questions? All right, thank you, everybody. We will be in touch soon with all that information I just ran through really quickly. We'll see you again in February. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.